In this lesson, we're going to talk about translations. A translation is a type of rigid motion, and a synonym for translation is slide. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is those properties of figures that are preserved during a rigid motion. A is angle measure. The first C is collinearity. Congruence. Distance. And parallelism. And the two ones that we're going to star are angle measure and distance. Now, when an object is translated, there is a specific type of notation that is used. There are two main ones. The first one is simply talking about the x and the y coordinates and how they change. So one way that you might see it written is x comma y, and then an arrow for like yields. And then you might see something like this, x plus 2, y minus 1. What that would mean is that for all of my x coordinates in my pre-image, I would add 2. And all my y coordinates, I would subtract 1 to get the coordinates in my image. Now, this is the same if I write it the second way, which is a capital T for translation. And instead of writing x comma y and then the yields, what we do is we write a capital T with a subscript, and we just write how it changes. So 2 comma negative 1. And again, this would mean the same thing. These both mean that we're going to add 2 to my x coordinate. And it also means that we're going to need to subtract 1 from y. So whichever way you see it written, they're the same meaning. We're going to do one of each right now. So to start, here I have a graph. I've already graphed my pre-image. This is my pre-image because nothing has happened. Think about the word pre meaning before. So this has been graphed, and now we're going to find and state the coordinates of my image. When I have A prime, B prime, C prime, that apostrophe meaning prime, that is always going to be my image. So one thing that we can do is we can either find and plot or simply just find, but I'm going to plot it as well. So in this case, looking at this notation, it says I'm going to take my x coordinate and add 4. So if I'm at A, I'm going to move 4 in a positive direction, which is to the right. So 1, 2, 3, 4. There's my point A prime. Oh, not quite, because I didn't go down. Oof, I forgot to go down 2. Now I'm going to move down to 1, 2. There's point A prime. Next, I'm going to move point B. Again, right 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then down 2. Here's point B prime. And lastly, point C, 1, 2, 3, 4, and down 2. Once I plot my figure, I can name my points. Or as I said before, I can also just do the math, and I'll show you right now what I mean by that. So instead of doing all of that work, what I really can do, if it doesn't say that I have to graph it, just find and state, is I can look at each of these coordinates here and simply add 4 to my x and subtract 2 from each y coordinate. So in this case, A prime, A was already at 6, 0, so to add 4 to my x would be at 10, and subtract 2 from my y, negative 2, and it just happens to coincide on my graph with that same point. Same thing with B. If I added 4 and then subtracted 2, I end up at 4, 2, which is precisely where I ended up when I graphed my figure. And the same with point C. Now the question follows up to say, if the measure of angle A was 27 degrees, determine the measure of A prime. Explain. So let's think about this. If A is 27, if it shifts on my grid and it slides, what would the measure of angle A prime be? It is also equal to 27. To explain, I would state that in a rigid motion, angle measure is preserved. Now we're going to move on to our next question, which is asked in a slightly different way. Again, my image or my pre-image has been plotted and I need to find my image. And this is my notation this time. I'm going to highlight it. Again, this means that I'm subtracting 4 from x and adding 6 to y. So I can just simply do the math. And sometimes when I see this, what I like to do is to write it up here and write subtract 4, add 6. Subtract 4, add 6, subtract 4, add 6. So if I take 6 and I subtract 4, I get 2. 0 plus 6 is 6. For point B, 0 minus 4 is negative 4. 4 plus 6 is 10. And lastly, negative 5 minus 4 is negative 9. And negative 1 plus 6 is positive 5. If I want to see how this moves on my grid, I can graph these points either by moving them in a negative direction for my x or just by following what I just determined were my coordinates. But either way, I can plot my figure so that we can see what it's going to look like. Here's A prime. B prime, and lastly, C prime. Now the question asks, if the length of AB is 7, what is the length of A prime B prime? A prime B prime would also be equal to 7 because rigid motions, well, let me start again. Because a translation is a rigid motion, and rigid motions preserve distance.